Hey guys, it's Leah. Welcome back, or welcome if you are new, and welcome to my February wrap up. February for me was absolutely the best reading month that I think I've probably had in about 2 years. I ended up reading 17 books. Not only am I absolutely thrilled that I read 17 books, but 11 of the 17 were on my physical TBR, and every single month, every single book that I read, I would love at least half of them to be from my physical TBR. I also read 6 out of 8 books that were on my February TBR. I just feel like it was such an amazing reading month in terms of all of the books that we read in quantity and quality, and my average rating for the month was 3.82 stars, which I'm also very, very happy with. I feel like that is quite high for me. So let's just get into all of the books that I read, as always, from worst to best. The worst book that I read in February was unfortunately from an author who I've read one book from before. I actually read that initial book in university and I really, really loved it. The book was Sexing the Cherry by Jeanette Winterson. I read Orange is Not the Only Fruit, I want to say 2 years ago now, and I utterly so enjoyed it. I loved it so much. I loved her writing style. Jeanette Winterson is absolutely a modern classic author who has so much range. I think the way that she writes fairy tale-esque retellings are always so astounding. But in the same breath, she writes novels that are so incredibly unique and are so beautiful and so eloquent, and I just normally really, really loved, well, I loved Orange is Not the Only Fruit. But Sexing the Cherry, unfortunately, I just really didn't love as much at all. I'm not sure if that's because I read it in a 24-hour readathon. Maybe if I had sat with it a lot longer, I would have liked it more. It was unfortunately the worst book that I read in terms of enjoyment. I ended up rating this one 2.5 stars. Now, one in a very similar vein, however, this one is a little bit more devastating because it is from one of my favourite authors, Shirley Jackson. I also read this one in a 24-hour readathon. This one is a tiny, tiny little short story collection. I think there are literally only like 2 or 3 short stories. It is so small, it's 50 pages. But that was The Missing Girl by Shirley Jackson, as I said. Unfortunately, didn't like this anywhere near as much. I already cannot remember any of it. Like, I could reread this for the first time again right now and it would be a new experience. I am still really, really happy that I did get around to it because Shirley Jackson, as I said, is one of my favourite authors of all time. I think the way that she writes the Gothic is so beautiful and so reminiscent to like 19th century Gothic, and is equally so unique, and I just love her writing style so much. Albeit this collection definitely did not feel as Gothic as all of her other works. Potentially that also was why I was lacking the enjoyment, but yeah, unfortunately a disappointment, but I did rate it 3 stars. I absolutely love doing the worst to best format for my wrap-ups. I've been doing it for years at this point. However, if anyone would prefer my wrap-ups from here on out to be just in chronological order or maybe a different format, I'm so aware that with this format that I'm currently doing, videos obviously start out fairly negative in comparison to the way that they end, but I also do like the build-up. So if it is something that you enjoy, if you like the worst to best format, please let me know. I'm open to changing it up this year. However, the next worst book that I read in February is Natural Beauty by Lin Huang. We have a running theme here because this book was another one that I read in the 24-hour readathon that I did in February. However, this one was absolutely a 5-star prediction, so it's definitely a bit more of a letdown than the other ones, unfortunately. I love literary horror so much. I love literary horror that also has the subgenre of discussing the beauty industry and like beauty expectations for women. This is one that I saw so many people with very similar reading taste to me absolutely love, rate 5 stars, like their favourite book of all time, babe. Not for me though. I'm not gonna lie, I can't sit here and say that I think the reason I didn't like this was because I read it in a 24-hour readathon. I've read so many books in a 24-hour readathon that I've absolutely adored and are favourites. For this one, what really didn't work for me was the pacing, which is quite contradictory because obviously I read it so incredibly quick, but the pacing was just so off. I really felt like not that much was happening, and equally I just really was not interested in what was happening the slight times. What I did like, however, was the exploration of these characters. All of these characters were so flawed and were so messy, and I love reading about characters like that, and this was perfect in that sense. I think I just went into it with such high expectations that ultimately if it wasn't a 5-star, it always would have let me down in some way. But yeah, unfortunately, I think I rated this one 3 stars, 3.25, so not quite the 5-star, but I'm still happy that I finally got around to it. The next book is Phantasma by Kaylee Smith. Here on out, we definitely had books that I finally was enjoying. This book was so fun. I initially heard that it was pitched as Caraval by Stephanie Garber, but make it more adult, and I knew that this was like a dark fantasy romance, and I don't really dabble into the dark fantasy genre, nor the dark romance genre. It's never really been something that I've read before. I don't know if I'm really open to reading it, but I was really intrigued. I obviously read this for this video here. You're essentially following a protagonist who essentially takes part in these games and this trial that takes place in like this haunted house. What I really liked about this was the occult setting. I loved the atmosphere so much. I think it was Gothic in many different senses. It still remained so fun and didn't take itself entirely serious. I think some of the dialogue, I mean, absolutely was not serious at all. That definitely diminished my liking slightly. But in terms of the atmosphere and in terms of all of the different characters and like the supernatural beings beings and like just the occult, as I said. I really liked it. I think in that sense it was a very unique fantasy romance. I never really read anything like that before. I will say it was definitely tropey, but that doesn't really take away my enjoyment for a fantasy at all. Would I reread it to have another fun time? Yeah, I absolutely would. I'm not gonna lie. I don't know when I'm gonna get to the second book. I'm definitely intrigued. I think I'm likely going to wait to see what other people's reviews are of it. Like I said, ultimately I had so much fun with this. There were just certain parts of the plot that I didn't like, and the writing at times I didn't like, so I rated it 3.25 stars. We have another fantasy, and that is Ruthless Vows by Rebecca Ross, another one that I read in a video. I loved Divine Rivals so much. It was one of my 5 stars, I think, of last year. I absolutely adored it, and I was so eager to get to this book. I'm not gonna lie, the book hangover that I had after Divine Rivals was real. However, I had had this on my shelf ever since it was published. I never got around to it, and I think I should have probably read them sort of back to back. Initially when it was published, I saw so many mixed reviews for this book, but I do think solely maybe because Divine Rivals was so hyped, like so many people adored it. It was so many people's favourite, so many people's 5-star reads of that year. Often, obviously, a sequel doesn't always live up to its first part, and I would agree with that definitely in this series. However, I am so happy that I finally read it. I was so happy to be in this world again with these 2 characters. I think the way that the first book ended definitely set up initially a lot of heartbreak for this book, and like the first 25% was so hard to read. I was actually listening to the audiobook, I think, and I just remember sitting there and I was like, this is so hard to read. Like, I love these characters so much, my heart is breaking, and then things obviously evolve. I really liked it. I definitely think it was a satisfying end to the duology. Definitely not my favourite sequel in a duology, but again, I'm still so happy that I read it. Even if you just read Divine Rivals, I definitely think this sequel is worth the read, and as I said, it was a really satisfying end to the duology. I rated it 3.25 stars. Then we have a book that I read on my Kindle, and that was Deep Cuts by Holly Brickley. This one I read in my Valentine's prompts picks what I read for a week. This video was so fun to film. I actually really enjoyed it. Did it flop? Absolutely, but I had the time of my life filming it, so I really don't mind. This book is a very new 2025 release. I knew I really wanted to read it because I saw it on so many like anticipated fiction on the like Goodreads lists, and it sounded like something I would really enjoy. We are following a protagonist who is utterly obsessed with music. However, she says she doesn't really have any musical talent. She doesn't sing, nor does she play a musical instrument, but she knows a lot about the music industry. And then one day she walks into this bar on campus and she meets this singer-songwriter, and the rest is essentially history. We are kind of following their push and pull dynamic. It is such an interesting read. I heard a lot of comparisons to Daisy Jones and the Six, and I think that that ultimately is kind of inevitable with this sort of read now. I do in a way sort of feel like that inevitably sets a book up for failure, because like, does it compare to Daisy Jones and the Six? Very slightly in some ways. I will say it definitely didn't live up to the expectation that I had for it. I really adored these characters. As I said, I really enjoyed their push and pull dynamic. I think when characters are messy like that and they are so flawed, it makes for a really compelling story and a really compelling relationship and dynamic, and it definitely did that. I think in terms of the writing, there were just so many pop culture references. I don't mind some pop culture references. Like, some of the pop culture references in this book I really adore. When I tell you, it was every other sentence. Like, every other sentence had a pop culture reference, and I don't feel like that needed to be there. It definitely took me out of the story slightly. Other than that, I did enjoy it. I think the second half of the book was a lot stronger than the first half of the book. I do now know also that it is being adapted. I can't remember who's playing the characters. I'll pop it on screen here, because when I saw that I did slightly scream, because the whole time I was reading it I did think this would be brilliantly adapted. Everything is so vivid and feels so realistic, and it's so rooted in the real world. Perhaps maybe because of the excessive pop culture references, maybe it's a double-edged sword. Really excited for that. I think as a book though, it definitely didn't hold up to my expectations. I rated it 3.25 stars. Then we have a book from arguably my favourite fantasy author in the world, Songbird and the Heart of Stone by Carissa Broadbent. I cannot believe it took me so long to finally get around to this book, but I'm so happy that I finally read it in February. This is the newest installment in the Crowns of Nyaxia series. In the Crowns of Nyaxia series, we essentially have 3 duologies. This is the first book in the second duology. The second book, I believe, comes out in August this year, which I'm really excited for now. I adore this series and I adore Carissa Broadbent's work so much, so I went into this with very high expectations, expecting it to be like a 5-star read. Was it a 5-star read? Unfortunately not. It definitely is likely my least favourite, I think, Carissa Broadbent that I've read yet. Apologies if the angle has changed slightly, my camera battery died, but we're back. As I was saying, in the Songbird and the Heart of Stone, we are essentially following Mish, who was a character in the original duology. I really adored Mish in the original duology, and I was really intrigued to see what her perspective and her narrative would be like as a protagonist. And in the first half of the book, I think because I hadn't read a Carissa Broadbent, and especially I hadn't read anything in the Crowns of Nyaxia series for a really long time, I kind of had to reacquaint myself with the world and all of the characters. Naturally, it did take me a minute to kind of readjust myself into this world again, but I really adored her as a protagonist, especially by the end of the book. I think her character arc and her growth is astounding. I love the way that Carissa Broadbent Broadbent writes about her. In terms of the actual plot, I think one of the main reasons that it is my least favourite Chrissa Broadbent arguably is due to the fact that I really struggled visualising the majority of the book. In it, our main characters are essentially descending into the like afterlife, descending into the underworld, descending into hell. I just really struggled in visualising it. I sometimes thought the descriptions were slightly confusing, but I will say 50% of the way through I definitely kind of got to grips with it. And even in terms of the love interest, I really didn't believe their chemistry to begin with, and simultaneously with the love interest I think I struggled in seeing some of their chemistry together. But as the book was picking up pace and obviously more context was given, I actually fell in love with them. Like the ending of this book, I need the second book in my hands right now. Like, I'm so excited. I feel like I'm inevitably, I would hope, gonna prefer that one to this. I really enjoyed specifically the last 40% of this book. I think if the entirety of the book were like the last 40%, it would have been really highly rated, like maybe a 5-star. Really loved their chemistry and their banter and their dynamic by the end. The smut in this book too, babe. I'm not gonna lie, Carissa Broadbent knows how to write smut. And just the ending in general, I was actually, like, my jaw was actually on the floor. I did one of those things where like you recoil and you sit up in bed as you're reading it. I couldn't really believe it. I'm scared for the next book, quite frankly, but I really enjoyed this. It ended up being 3.75 stars. Then we have a very different kind of read, and that is Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. I've wanted to read a book by this author for so many years. He is a modern classic author. I've had so many friends absolutely adore his work and I just never got around to it. I finally picked up Siddhartha. It was on my February TBR, and I was going into this already knowing the story because last year I actually saw an orchestrated adaptation of the book and it was absolutely astounding. So I did go into it knowing the plot already. It was really nice though to read the original story from his writing and his narrative. This is such a classic piece of literature and I can see why so many people absolutely adore it and why it has and will continue to stand the test of time. I really enjoyed it. I'm so happy that I finally read it. I realised that I didn't even light my candles again, so I'm just gonna do that real quick. I feel like this wrap up is really chaotic, but alas. I really enjoyed reading from Siddhartha's character. He is a character that is so rooted in hope and desire and also kind of sin and the sort of balance of it all. I just really enjoyed reading this for the first time. I'm very intrigued to read some more from this author. If anyone else has any good recommendations, please let me know, but really happy to have finally read this, and it was 4 stars. Then we have a book that I read on my Kindle, and that is Ready or Not by Cara Bastone. One that I read in my Valentine's prompts video. I really enjoyed this. I read this because it was a friends to lovers. I had seen it circulating fairly recently actually. I see so many people talking about it. I saw so many booktubers talk about it, and I just heard it was a really good romance, and I really had a good time with this. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I absolutely binge read it. Like, I read it in one entire sitting in one day. I could not put it down. In this, we are essentially following our protagonist who has a one-night stand and falls pregnant. That is not a spoiler, it literally happens at the beginning of the book. Of course, following her perspective as she comes to terms with the fact that she is pregnant, as she tries to figure out the dynamics between her and the dad, and then also all of her friendships surrounding her. I think my favourite thing about this book is the found family and just how much they all love each other. I think this book is such a breath of fresh air. It felt so healthy and it felt so communicative, and I just absolutely adored it. Like, when I say I flied through it, I could not put it down. I would highly recommend this as a good romance, but I would say that I think this one is best going into knowing as little as possible because, like I said, you're going to want to binge read it, and it's also just so fun and so light-hearted whilst balancing the serious and really heavy topics. But I think that Cara Bastone did it absolutely phenomenally, and I'm so intrigued to see what she does next, so I would highly recommend. I rated it 4 stars. And we have another romance. This one was on my physical TBR. It was Wild Love by Elsie Silver. This was my first ever Elsie Silver. I cannot believe that I finally got around to one of her books. I've always been very intrigued by the Chestnut Spring series specifically. I've had a lot of people recommend that series to me, but I've never read anything with cowboys. I've never read like a cowboy romance, and I know a lot of people love that, so I'm very intrigued. I think I am gonna go onto the Chestnut Spring series at some point. I do know that technically you were meant to read that series before this. I know they're interconnected, but I am just gonna carry on with the Rose Hill series and then likely go into the Chestnut Springs. I really enjoyed this. I really did not know what to expect when it came to her writing and her romances. In this one, we are essentially following a billionaire who one day unexpectedly finds out he has a daughter by her turning up on his doorstep and just being like, "Hi, you're my dad." And it is just a beautiful story really about their dynamic, about how you would handle that situation when they build their relationship. It is such a beautiful read and also quite a heavy one, but simultaneously the whole hottest billionaire thing definitely adds a lightheartedness and definitely adds so much fun. And Rosie as another protagonist, those with the 2 love interests, absolutely adored her. I thought she was so witty and I thought she was so headstrong. I really loved her as a protagonist, and it is also dual POV, which I do love in a romance. This was just so fun. Like, I had so much fun with this. I really enjoyed my time reading it, and like I said, I'm really excited to carry on with the series. I am gonna read Wild Eyes probably this month, especially because I know that the 3rd book, is it Wild Side, has literally just been published at the time we filming this, so I'm very excited to get round to all of those. But I've really enjoyed Wild Love. I'm very excited to read some more Elsie glossy silver, very intrigued. I just feel like these are going to be great palette cleansers for me, so I loved it. 4 stars. And the last contemporary romance book that we have for the month was The Full Risk by Abby Jimenez. Actually, on reflection, I would probably put that below Wild Love and Ready or Not because it is a short story, but I really enjoyed this so much. I really love Abby Jimenez. She's definitely now one of my favourite romance authors. I saw that this book was on Prime and I instantly read it for my 24-hour readathon and I absolutely adored it. This one definitely has that formula that Abby Jimenez does so brilliantly where it balances heavier topics and lightheartedness. This one I will definitely say should have a content warning. For stalkers, our female protagonist is being stalked and it very much does go into that, and many times it's hard to read because of it. But in my opinion, the way that it is written is done with so much care and consideration. I loved these characters so much. I so wish it was a full-length novel. It's always the danger, I think, with short stories, especially romance ones, where it can feel quite insta-lovey because obviously it has to all be over so quick because it's literally like, what, 70 pages? This one did it so good. I fully believed their chemistry. I loved their banter so much. I just loved these protagonists as individuals, but especially when they came together. I definitely think this is a good entryway into seeing what her writing style is like. I just absolutely adored it, so I rated that one 4 stars also. Then we have one that I solely listened to the audiobook for, and that is Open Throat by Henry Hoke. I had this on my radar for years. I've always been so intrigued about it because I love strange literary fiction, literary just commentary with really weird narratives, and this one was exactly that. We are essentially following the perspective and the narrative of a mountain lion in LA, which I believe actually existed. I think it was a real mountain lion. We're following its perspective on humanity, and one thing I love so much in literature, and especially short literature with really strange narratives and really unique narratives, is when it does discuss the human race and humanity and doesn't sugarcoat it. It absolutely highlights the ugliness of humanity and who we are as people and how flawed we are in many different aspects. And it is such a short book. I think the audiobook was about 1 hour and 40 minutes, which is tiny, and I think the fact that it packed such a punch was so incredible. The writing was absolutely phenomenal. I would have read pages and pages. I would have read like a 700-page book on this mountain lion's perspective. I thought it was so beautiful and so real and raw. The ending of this too definitely brought a tear to my eye. It was so moving. Definitely one of the most unique books that I've read in a really long time, and just one that I would highly recommend. I just absolutely adored it, and I rated that one 4 stars also. Going on to another book that I read physically, it is The Lamb by Lucy Rose. I went into this with such high expectations because I saw so many people loving it. It is a really new 2025 release. It is literary horror, and I love anything literary horror period, but especially if it has like cannibalistic nature. I've said it openly, proudly, non-apologetically so many times that like cannibalism as a metaphor for love or grief, I eat up. Whether it's going to be in film or literature, I love it so much. Fear the girls that get it, get it. I think it opens so much possible discussion and so much beauty and so much ugliness and rawness, and I just think it is such an incredible... I could talk about this forever. I'm gonna start rambling. This essentially is a literary horror. It's a folk horror and it talks about cannibalism. This is such a unique read, and I love Ethel Cain so much. Ethel Cain is my favourite artist arguably currently. She was my most listened to artist last year. Strangers was my most listened to song last year, and I absolutely don't say this lightly, but Strangers by Ethel Cain, which is my #1 song of all time, is the ending of this book. We're essentially following a mother and daughter. It is kind of a coming of age story, but we are following a daughter who is growing up. Her relationship with her mum is a very fascinating and very heartbreaking dynamic. It talks a lot about her mother's carnivore desire and how that is inflicted upon the daughter when they find strangers out, because they live in the middle of nowhere. They find strangers, they offer them like safekeep and warmth, and then they just essentially eat them. It is such a fascinating and unique and heartbreaking and quiet and really somber, but such a beautiful story. Ending of this book actually gagged me. Like my jaw was on the floor. Like I actually could not believe it. I did have my suspicions, but when it came to it, the way that it was written, I actually had to stare at a blank wall for like 3 hours straight afterwards. I'm never gonna forget this ending. The ending was 5 stars for me. The only sort of downfall that I had with this book personally was the pacing. I think in the middle it did get slightly repetitive. Very aware that that's probably just a narrative choice. This book is meant to feel incredibly claustrophobic, and it does, and very repetitive in like their repeated everyday cycle. It did mean that when reading it, the pacing for me was slightly off, but as I said, like the ending was 5 stars. I think about this book all of the time. Granted, I only read it like a month ago, but still. And I would highly recommend it to anyone who likes literary horror and likes these sort of discussions. It's definitely a really heavy read, especially at the end, but it is one that is completely unforgettable and I'm gonna think about it forever. So I would highly recommend it. I rated it 4.25 stars. I just adored it. Okay, we have 4 books left, but I'm gonna talk about the next one, or the next 2 in unison. And those I read on my Kindle, they are on Kindle Unlimited. It was Spark of the Everflame and Glow of the Everflame by Pen Cole. I had been so excited to start this Romantasy series for so long, especially after Emmy, always talking about it, always praising it. I just knew I wanted to get to it. And oh my god, did it take over my life. I'm not gonna lie, babe, absolute hyperfixation. It was all I could think about in February. It's all I wanted to read in February. I went into the series thinking that all 4 books were already published, but no babe, just the first 3, and we kind of have no idea when the 4th book is being published. So I'm really hesitant to read Heat of the Everflame, which is the 3rd one, because obviously we don't know when the 4th one is going to be, and it's also 1,000 pages. I think I could even completely fully describe why I just adored the series so much. I think I read it at a pivotal time where it was exactly what I needed. Absolutely flew through the first book, and then I absolutely flew through the second book. I read like the last 70-80% of the second book, and it's like a 700-page book at night. I stayed up until 3 a.m. finishing it, and I haven't done that for a book in years. It was such an incredible experience. But we are essentially following our protagonist. He lives in a mortal world that has been colonized by the gods, and in this world there are things called the Descended, which are essentially offspring of the gods. The mortals in this world have brown eyes, the Descended have like blue eyes. It is very recognizable who is Descended and who isn't, and it is just so full of political intrigue, following a world that is so tense and feels like it's constantly on the edge of war. And our protagonist is a healer. Her mother is also a healer, but we find out that her mother is missing, so we are very much following our protagonist trying to kind of figure out what has happened to her, and in doing so she kind of gets opportunities to heal the Descended and visit the royal palace, and it is just so good. I love the political intrigue so much. I absolutely love the world building, and I love the lore of this world. This is also a slow burn romantasy series. I heard obviously before going into it that it was incredibly slow burn, but you're never really sure like how slow burn. Sometimes people say it's slow burn and like they kiss like 50% of the way through and like whatever, but this one I was going into it, babe, it's slow burn, like slow burn, and I'm absolutely living for it. Like still the tension in where I am now, and I'm about to get into the 3rd book. There's so much tension and I love them so much, but I will say the protagonist in general is slightly annoying at times. I do really think TM as a protagonist is so witty and so headstrong and is so interesting, and I really do love her character, but at times, my god, did she make decisions that would make me want to throw my Kindle at the wall. Like sometimes it just did not make sense. She is slightly insufferable sometimes, but babe, we can all be insufferable. We all have our flaws. I just kind of looked that aside because I just enjoyed this world so much and just this plot. As I said, I did read Spark of the Everflame and Glow of the Everflame in February. Spark of the Everflame I rated 4 stars. Glow of the Everflame I rated 4.5. I really want to get to the 3rd book soon. I was actually going to pick it up the second that I finished Glow of the Everflame, because the ending of that book, I needed the next book, but I was so aware once I found out that the 4th book, we don't know when it's out. I didn't want to leave a massive gap between the 3rd book and the 4th book. However, I think I am hopefully going to get around to it soon. I might be able to fit it into a video, which really excites me. Yeah, I just fell in love with the series in February, so I wanted to talk about them in unison. I'm very excited to carry on with the series. Then on to the top 2 best books that I read in February. Second best book, and it's the second 5-star that I've read all year, is The Favourites by Lane Fargo. This is the proof copy, hence why it doesn't have the proper cover, but oh my god, this was my February book club pick. I've been excited to get into this ever since it was published because I saw so many really high, like 5-star ratings. So many people were adoring it. I'm anticipating it to be a lot of people's favourites for the year. Oh my god, did it deliver on every single one of my expectations. This was obviously a 5-star. I could not believe how much I love this. We are essentially following Katerina and Heath, who are kind of childhood friends, but they also ice skate together. Heath grew up in the foster care system. Katerina's family kind of gave him safe haven, and it's just such a beautiful story about friendship, but equally about love and about desire and about your want to accomplish something so much that you'll kind of do anything to get there. As I said, they are figure skaters, and Katerina's dream has always to be an Olympic gold medalist, like ice skater, and it's just such a beautiful story. I cannot talk about this without wanting to cry. As a matter of fact, I actually sobbed when finishing this book. You will see it in a vlog soon. I sobbed like a bitch. Oh my god, I actually can't. I really actually do think it's best going into this knowing as little as possible, because it really did floor me. There is so much drama. I heard this be pitched as like Magnolia Parks meets Daisy Jones and the Six. I think the reason people kind of compare it to Daisy Jones and the Six is there is an interview narrative. The majority of the book we are following Katerina's perspective, but every other chapter we also have like interview styles, and I've come to learn that I absolutely love that in a book. I did mainly flick between the physical copy and the audiobook, and I would highly recommend listening to the audiobook actually, because it has an ensemble cast and it just makes the experience so immersive. It was so messy, the characters were so flawed and so real and so human, and did I want to throw my book at the wall again? So many times. Absolutely I did. Especially in the last 20% of the book, Lane Fargo, oh my god, the way that she just made me so angry through these characters. I can only applaud an author for making me have that sort of reaction when reading words on paper. Like, it's actually crazy if you deep it. Absolutely loved it. I will say that this has also been pitched as like a Wuthering Heights retelling, and I kind of go back and forth of my opinion of that. I'm a massive Bronte lover. I've studied the Brontes for literally years of my life. My dissertation was on the Brontes. I know a lot about the Brontes and Wuthering Heights, and going into this expecting a Wuthering Heights retelling was one of my biggest hesitations because I didn't want to kind of nitpick at that. And I will say For me personally, if I hear a Wuthering Heights retelling, I'm gonna assume it's gothic. This in no way is gothic in whatever shape or form, not at all. I can definitely see the Wuthering Heights nods, especially to do with Katerina and Heath. I mean, even to do with their names, but also their dynamic. Heath as a character, there are absolutely plot points that are very similar to Wuthering Heights, so I can appreciate that and I can notice that. But for me, saying that then it's a Wuthering Heights retelling doesn't really work, in my opinion. I don't know, that might be an unpopular opinion. I just personally don't think in anything really you can call something specifically a Wuthering Heights retelling just because it has similar plot structure. But with that being said, obviously it absolutely did not deter my enjoyment because it was a 5-star. I'm gonna be thinking about this book forever. I'm gonna be thinking about the ending forever. I just absolutely adored it. I would highly recommend. And the last book that I also actually read in February, and the best book that I read, was a reread. Do I feel like it's slightly cheating having it at the top, considering one, I've read it before, but two, it is also my favourite book of all time. It is Near to the Wild Heart by Clarice Lispector. This was for my bi-monthly classic book club with my patrons. Every 2 months we start a new classic book together, we read it together. It's always so much fun, but this was the one for January and February, so I finished it obviously in February. This was obviously a reread. Clarice Lispector is my favourite author of all time. This is my #1 favourite book of all time, but it was also my first time ever rereading it. I thought that the reread was so fascinating. I read it for the first time 2 years ago now, and reading this, again, even though it was 2 years ago, brought a new experience for me. I noticed a lot more, or a lot of different things this time around that I really adored. In Near to the Wild Heart, we are following Joanna, who is a young girl in her 20s, and we are just essentially following her life. We are following her experience of being a young woman in her 20s and kind of grappling all of that and the joys of that and the heartbreaks of that, but simultaneously she loses her dad very young, so we are also following her grief. But it's just a story about wanting to be desired and what you will kind of do in order to be desired and to be loved, and simultaneously just to be seen, what it is like to be seen and to be perceived and to be acknowledged. It is just such a unique, beautiful read that I really do think anyone can get anything out of. Following her every single thought, even the ones that aren't necessarily nice to hear or are arguably quite controversial. It is just such a compelling read. Like I said, my favourite book of all time. As I'm sure you already know, Clarice Lispector can never do any wrong in my eyes. Her narratives and her storytelling and her writing is just the most beautiful thing that I've ever read in my entire life, and I'm so glad that I got the opportunity to read this again because, oh my god, I'm gonna want to read this every year for the rest of my life. It is so compelling to me. I relate to Joanna in many ways, also not so much in many ways. I just find this book an absolute joy and an absolute heartbreak to read, and I'm so happy that I got to reread it again. So I just love this so much. I've spoken about Clarice Lispector endlessly. I will continue to speak about Clarice Lispector endlessly. I actually kind of want to do a whole video talking about her. If that is something you would want to see, let me know. But yeah, the last book that I read in February, and obviously the best book because it's my favourite book of all time, even though it was a reread, was Near to the Wild Heart by Clarice Lispector, and obviously I rated that 5 stars. Those were the 17 books that I read in February. If you have read any other books that I also read, please let me know what you thought about them, whether you like them or you dislike them. Simultaneously, feel free to let me know what your favourite book of February was, or your least favourite even. Whether you would like to recommend me a book, or you think I should never read a certain book, I would love to hear. Or if you watched till the very end of the video and you don't know what to comment but you want to show you stayed until the end, comment any red emoji for Near to the Wild Heart. As always, all of my socials are linked down in the description box below. I have my Patreon, my TikTok, my Instagram, my Goodreads, I think my Fable now, and so much more. Thank you so much for watching and for spending some time with me. I really hope you enjoyed, and I will see you again very soon with another video.